Good day. Today is Thursday, 20th February 2025, and the last 24 hours have been, again, quite extraordinary in the Ukrainian crisis. And my own view is that we are probably looking at the point of no return in terms of relations between President Zelensky and Donald Trump, between the Ukraine and the United States, and perhaps we're closer now than we have ever been to the position where the United States essentially withdraws itself from active involvement in the war. Now, I think it's perhaps necessary to reconstruct and understand exactly what has happened over the last 24 hours, because again, I don't think that this is being reported fully or properly. In my program yesterday, I went to very, very great length at the start of the program to explain that contrary to media claims which had appeared in the European media and the British media in Europe, but also which have been picked up to some extent in the United States, President Trump never said that Ukraine was to blame for the war. You may believe that. Perhaps Donald Trump thinks that at times, but that is not what he actually said over the course of the press conference in Mar-a-Lago, which had taken place the day before. He was responding over the course of that press conference to the visible petulance and anger of President Zelensky, in that he was not involved in the discussions that took place between the Americans and the Russians in Riyadh. And President Trump made the simple point that Zelensky has had 3 years, the Ukrainians have had 3 years to come up with peace proposals, to find some way of avoiding getting involved in an unwinnable war. They'd many opportunities. I listed them in my program yesterday. Minsk 1, Minsk 2, Istanbul, all kinds of other things in between, to come to an agreement with the Russians. And they failed to achieve an agreement with the Russians, despite the fact that the Russians repeatedly showed a willingness to come to an agreement with them. In fact, at Minsk in February 2015, a signed agreement was actually reached and apparently approved by the Ukrainian government, at that time led by President Poroshenko, was backed by the Western powers, and was approved unanimously by the UN Security Council, though the Minsk agreement was never honoured by Ukraine, a fact which Ukrainian officials have not only admitted, but even bragged about. Well, that was what Donald Trump said. But the story then appeared, as I said, right across the media, that he'd said something completely different, that Ukraine was to blame for the war, that it was Ukraine that in some way started the war. As I said, that was not actually what Donald Trump said. And the stage, therefore, was set, as I also discussed yesterday, for President Zelensky to give a press conference at which he would refute the claim that Ukraine had started the war, which Donald Trump had not in fact said. And, well, Zelensky and his media handlers and his briefers worked very, very hard, obviously, to prepare for this press conference. It was postponed for a time as this briefing operation took place, and then the press conference happened, and it was, in my opinion, the single most disastrous press conference. Disastrous perhaps not for Zelensky himself, who is, in my opinion, politically speaking, now a dead man walking, but potentially for Ukraine itself. For Ukraine, the country which President Zelensky still leads. Anyway, over the course of this press conference, Zelensky ruled out elections. The Americans and the Russians have spoken about the necessity of elections. The Russians have cast doubt about President Zelensky's legitimacy as Ukraine's president, given the fact that he did not hold elections in Ukraine when his term ran out last year. The Americans have already begun to express doubts about Zelensky's leadership of Ukraine, and we know that relations between Zelensky and Trump have become increasingly rocky, and they have been so for a very long time, and the Americans themselves have been thinking that maybe the time has come for Zelensky to go and elections might be the way forward. Well, Zelensky ruled out elections. He was not prepared to hold elections. He gave, in my opinion, no really coherent explanation of why that was so. Obviously, he didn't address the issues, the points made by Putin about the Ukrainian constitution, but I'm not going to discuss any of that in this program. So he ruled out elections. He made it very clear that he has no intention of giving up power. He went on at inordinate length about his continued popularity in Ukraine. Now, all of this arose from a comment by Trump over the course of the press conference that Zelensky's popularity or trust rating had fallen to 4%. I think, again, that it was absurd of Zelensky to take that seriously. Trump often plucks numbers off the top of his head. He does that repeatedly with Russian casualty totals also. And the Russians have been annoyed about it, but they've been very, very careful not to take umbrage or to engage Trump in a shouting match over the issue. But Zelensky did exactly that over the course of the press conference. He went on and on about how popular he was, how he supports his favorability rating is 57% or whatever it is, that he's still popular and widely supported by the Ukrainian people. He harped on this, opening himself up to the challenge which some people in the United States have already brought, which is why, if he's so popular, is he not willing to conduct elections? But never mind. Anyway, Zelensky went to inordinate lengths about this. He also said nothing at all about rescinding his decree of 2nd October 2022, prohibiting Ukraine from conducting negotiations with Russia. It is very strange that people do not touch on this fact, even though the Russians themselves raise it constantly. Zelensky insists that Ukraine must have a place in negotiations, but he himself has ruled out negotiations with Russia. He has a decree in place that prohibits this, and he's been repeatedly invited by the Russians to rescind this decree, and he has repeatedly refused to do so. Putin has had more to say about this, which I will discuss later in this program. And then Zelensky made what I think was an absolutely disastrous mistake. He spoke about Donald Trump functioning inside a disinformation bubble. He implied that Trump was in some way being misled by the Russians. He talked about how Trump had obtained information, perhaps through Rubio and Waltz, after meeting with the Russians, information which was untrue, that Trump had been deceived. And the way he did it, the way Zelensky did it, inevitably reminded and was clearly intended to remind people of the Russiagate allegations that Donald Trump was being controlled or manipulated or run by the Russians in some way. Now, about a week ago, shortly after Trump's telephone call with Putin, an article appeared in the Daily Telegraph, which straightforwardly, though ineffectively, attempted to revive the Russiagate allegations. It stopped short of repeating the central allegation that Trump was an agent of the Kremlin, or that Trump had been colluding with the Kremlin in some way during the 2016 election, and or that the Russians had some kind of blackmail material over Trump and were using that in order to force Trump into all sorts of concessions. But again, it did sort of insinuate that there was some kind of connection between Trump and the Russians without really going into any explanation as to what that was. Now, that article, I suspect, ultimately drew from suggestions made by Ukraine. I'm going to express my own opinions now, which have developed since I did my program yesterday. I said that there had been clearly a degree of orchestration right across the media, that somebody had been putting out the story that Donald Trump had blamed Ukraine for starting the war, when, as I said, that was not what Trump said. I wondered whether it was someone in Europe who had been behind that. I now think it was more likely originated in Kiev, in Ukraine. The Ukrainians have developed a very sophisticated media operation for a long time. They talk to journalists regularly. They have contacts with many of the editors and many of the reporters across the West. And I can quite easily imagine that they could have run an operation like the one we saw yesterday. And I suspect that it's they who have been going about whispering to people that Trump clearly has something with the Russians, even though we can't quite work out what it is. And here we have Zelensky publicly coming out and repeating all of that in a press conference. Well, unsurprisingly, Donald Trump was furious. I'm still not clear what exactly it was that Zelensky thought he was doing. Whether he thought this would embarrass Trump, whether it would rally support against Trump in the United States or in Europe. I'm not sure what the intention was, but whatever it was, it backfired horribly. And if you were reading, as I did, the media in Britain yesterday, one could see the accumulating horror as people in London began to understand that the result of Zelensky's press conference was an irreconcilable rift between Donald Trump and Zelensky himself, and potentially between Ukraine and the United States. Anyway, Zelensky's comment provoked a ferocious response from Donald Trump, which appeared on Truth Social. And I'm going to read it out. Think of it. A modestly successful comedian, Vladimir Zelensky, talked the United States of America into spending $350 billion to go into a war that couldn't be won, that never had to start, but a war that he, without the United States and Trump, will never be able to settle. Trump writes the word Trump in capital letters and in quotation marks, not because he here is expressing narcissism, but because he is in effect repeating what the media and the commentary have been saying. Anyway, just to say. And then Trump continues, the United States has spent $200 billion more than Europe, and Europe's money is guaranteed, whilst the United States will get nothing back, which is a sign, by the way, that the Americans have written off completely the idea that they're going to get any of Ukraine's strategic minerals or cash flow. I never thought, I don't think, that this proposal that the Americans presented to the Ukrainians apparently a week before the meeting between Vance and Rubio in Munich, this proposal from the Americans that Ukraine give the United States 50% of its strategic minerals had any reality. To repeat again and quickly, the idea of Ukraine buying US support by, in effect, giving the United States a lien over its strategic minerals originated with none other than Zelensky himself. He first talked up this idea with his friend in Washington, Senator Lindsey Graham, who was the first to speak about it publicly. Then Zelensky apparently discussed it with Donald Trump when he met with Donald Trump in Trump Tower in New York in September. Zelensky then made the same proposal as part of his so-called victory plan, which he announced to the Ukrainian parliament. And, well, he harped on it ever afterwards. There has apparently been a geological survey or something of that kind, or at least a geological assessment of Ukraine, apparently by the main institute that does these things in the United States. And it says, apparently this survey or assessment or whatever it is, basically says that these vast stockpiles of minerals in Ukraine, which Zelensky has been talking about, don't even exist. Yes, Ukraine does have some manganese and some lithium in a few places, but nothing like on the scale that Zelensky has been talking about. I suspect that the Americans know this, and I have already made clear that, in my opinion, that proposal which they presented to Zelensky in Munich was simply their way of impressing upon him and upon the Ukrainians how much the United States has already spent on this enterprise and Ukraine's own complete inability to pay any of it back. Anyway, going back to Donald Trump again, why didn't sleepy Joe Biden demand equalization, in that this war is far more important to Europe than it is to us? We have a big, beautiful ocean of separation. Now, again, there are lots of different figures and numbers flying around about who's made the bigger financial contribution to Ukraine, the European Union or the United States. I am not going to get into this discussion at all. For the record, I think this figure of $350 billion that Trump is now floating is probably closer to the truth of the total American commitment to Ukraine, going all the way back to the time of the Orange Revolution and taking in the Maidan coup and all of that that's happened since then. But again, I'm not going to go into the numbers. But Trump's point, once again, is that the United States has made this enormous investment in Ukraine. It is never going to be repaid. And ultimately, Ukraine is not a vital interest of the United States. If it is of interest to anybody, it is of interest to the Europeans, who Trump says should therefore have carried much more of the burden. But then it really becomes ugly, because this is where Trump really expresses his anger, but also, because we're talking about Donald Trump, gives us an insight into his long-term plans. On top of this, Zelensky admits that half of the money we sent him is missing. That is absolutely true. That is exactly what Zelensky said about 10 days ago. He said that of the $179 billion which he says the United States has provided Ukraine, Ukraine can only account for $79 billion, or that was the money that Ukraine received. It cannot say what happened to the other $100 billion. I thought that was, again, an unwise thing for Zelensky to say in that context. And then Trump continues, Zelensky refuses to have elections, is very low in Ukrainian polls, and the only thing he was good at was playing Biden like a fiddle. A dictator without elections. Zelensky better move fast, or he's not going to have a country left. In the meantime, we are successfully negotiating an end to the war with Russia, something all admit only Trump and the Trump administration can do. Biden never tried. That is absolutely true. Europe has failed to bring peace. That is also true. And Zelensky probably wants to keep the gravy train going. I love Ukraine, but Zelensky has done a terrible job. His country is shattered and millions have unnecessarily died. And so it continues. And Trump, by the way, has since been speaking. He's apparently made a public speech in which he has again called Zelensky a dictator. And it is these words, dictator, with reference to Zelensky, that have provoked uproar across the media and in Europe. Now, at this point, I really want to just take a step back and make a few points about the current state of Ukraine. Ukraine does not have freedom of speech and of the media at the present time. Maybe that can be justified in terms of the war, but that is the reality. Strana, the Ukrainian website, media outlet, which I regularly read, which I consider one of the best Ukrainian media outlets around, has to operate outside Ukraine. Just saying. We've recently discovered that most of what is called the Ukrainian media, 90% of it, the Ukrainian media that functions inside Ukraine itself, that it has been receiving funding from the United States and that it is now struggling to function without that funding. So clearly there are issues with freedom of speech and of the media in Ukraine and diversity of the media in Ukraine. Political parties have been banned in Ukraine and cannot function. In the first days of the war, Zelensky arrested Viktor Medvedchuk, the leader of the Ukraine's biggest opposition party. He was accused of all kinds of things. He was accused of working for the Russians. Perhaps he did have contact with the Russians. Perhaps those contacts went further than was wise or appropriate for a Ukrainian politician. But of course, Medvedchuk was never tried, so we will never know. He was held in custody, eventually released in a prisoner swap, and is now in Russia. Other political parties, as I said, have been banned. There have been more restrictions. There have been restrictions on television outlets. These actually began in the first weeks of 2021, a full year before the Russians commenced the special military operation. I can remember clearly when it happened. Zelensky has also, as well as all of these things, enacted laws which restrict the use of the Russian language. There's been action taken against the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, which is now effectively banned. Church property has been seized. I understand that priests have been arrested, though I don't pretend to have the details. It is a troubling subject for me personally. An American journalist, Gonzalo Lira, a friend of mine, somebody who, if you don't want to call him a journalist, call him a prominent YouTuber, an American citizen expressing his opinions on YouTube, an American platform, exercising his rights of free speech, was arrested by Zelensky's police and held in detention on the basis of charges which I never understood, and died in detention. Other Ukrainian politicians who take radical stances on the war that mirror Zelensky's own, have faced harassment and prosecution as well. These include President Poroshenko, General Zaluzhny, recently an official close to the mayor of Kiev, Vitaly Klitschko, has also been arrested. Well, maybe you can explain and justify all of these various things if you want to, or some of them. You can perhaps say that Zelensky, these things even taken together, don't amount to dictatorship. The fact that people are being hauled off the street by press gangs and pressed into the army, that doesn't amount to dictatorship either. I'm not going to argue the point. All I would say that if somebody looking at Ukraine from the outside decides that this is not a country which is currently free, well, I wouldn't argue with them. And as for Zelensky himself, well, again, I'm not going to debate Putin's points about the Ukrainian constitution. It's not for me to do. But I would repeat again what is the indisputable fact that Zelensky's constitutional term ended in May last year, but he continues to be the president and is president by decree. Again, you can argue, if you choose, that this is perfectly appropriate, that doesn't make Zelensky a dictator, despite all of the other things that we have seen play out in Ukraine. You can do all of those things if you wish. You can come up with reasons. You can say validly that Ukraine is at war. But then, of course, wars happen in other countries and elections still take place in those countries. They did in the United States during its own civil war in the 1860s. They did in the United States during the 1940s, during the Second World War. But all right, I accept that's the United States. Ukraine is a different country. Maybe you shouldn't expect the same in Ukraine that you do in the United States. But Zelensky refuses to conduct elections. He insists that people support him. He proposes no plan to end the war. All of these things that I've discussed are taking place in Ukraine. Is it so unreasonable to express concerns about it? And if Donald Trump calls the person who presides over all of that a dictator, does he not at least have a case? Just saying. Anyway, there we are. The point is that this was a furious riposte from Donald Trump. And let me repeat again, the key point, the key words here, the key point here is that it shows a complete disgust with Zelensky on Donald Trump's part. And in my opinion, the most important words in this comment on Truth Social is not the one about Zelensky being a dictator, which is the one that everyone has latched onto. It is the one about Zelensky wanting to continue the war, probably because he wants to keep the gravy train going. Now that there is massive corruption in Ukraine, nobody disputes that all sorts of important people in Ukraine have benefited from that corruption. That nobody disputes either. The point is, the key point about this comment on Truth Social is that the United States, or rather Donald Trump, is saying enough is enough. We are not going to go on being taken for a ride in the way that we have been. We're not going to go on giving more and more money to the Ukrainians. $350 billion is the figure that Trump gives. Others, as I say it's less, but it still amounts to hundreds of billions of dollars. However you add up the figures, Trump is saying enough's enough. We're not going to go on. We're not going to go on keeping this gravy train going. If Zelensky doesn't want to make peace, well, we're doing what we can to end the war, but we're not going to go on giving money which we will never see paid back. So that, in my opinion, is the single most important part of this comment. Now, let me come back to what I consider Donald Trump's objectives to be. Now, I haven't spoken to Donald Trump. I've never met Donald Trump. Reading Donald Trump's mind is a difficult thing to do at the best of times, and reading anybody's mind is a challenge also. But it seems to me that if you look at what has been going on since Donald Trump was inaugurated President of the United States, and if you listen carefully to the things Donald Trump has been saying, then actually getting a sense of what he is trying to do is not that difficult. Firstly, he wants the war to end. It's an astonishing fact, but he is the only Western leader that I'm aware of who has spoken about the catastrophic tragedy that this war is. The fact that hundreds of thousands of people have died in it, both Ukrainian and Russian. That is indeed an appalling tragedy. And it's a shocking fact that people like Ursula von der Leyen, Olaf Scholz, Emmanuel Macron never talk about it in the way that Donald Trump does. Anyway, he does talk about it. You may take that not very seriously. You may say, well, this is Donald Trump. He's not an empathic person. He's not a person who's ever shown any real traces of humanity. You can take that view if you wish. But the fact is, Donald Trump has been talking about the tragedy of the war in the way that no one else does, and clearly he wants to end the war. Secondly, he wants to rebuild some kind of relationship with the Russians. He understands how dangerous the situation between Russia and the United States had become. He wants to end that. He understands that a relationship with the Russians is essential to secure peace. Now, on the point of how dangerous the situation with the Russians had become, just consider where we were this time last year. Avdiivka had either fallen or was about to fall. That then launched a series of panic-stricken discussions across the West. I remember Emmanuel Macron floating the possibility of sending French troops to Ukraine at precisely this time. This was not a peacekeeping force, mind, because there was no discussion at that time of peace. It was a force that was to be sent whilst the war was ongoing. And Macron, at various times, gave various explanations for it. The closest he ever came to providing a rational explanation, or at least a plausible explanation, was that it was intended to patrol the Ukrainian borders with Belarus and Russia so as to release Ukrainian troops so that they could fight the Russians more effectively. But anyway, Macron was talking about this incredibly dangerous idea of deploying French troops, which is to say NATO troops, openly in Ukraine. And as we discussed on the Duran at the time, that was a transparent attempt ultimately to involve the United States. The idea was the French go to Ukraine, the Russians treat them as combatants, which they would have been, in effect, and the French come scurrying to Washington, asking Biden, Blinken, Sullivan, and all of the others to deploy US military power to come to their rescue. It was a transparent device to draw the United States into the war. A war between two nuclear superpowers. Anyway, that didn't happen, but instead we got a completely different set of proposals, which was worked out over the following weeks with the British and the French, again, keenly enthusiastic on implementing them. And these were proposals to launch missiles, American, British, and French missiles into pre-2014 Russia, something which the Russians, President Putin himself, pointed out could only be done with direct involvement by NATO technicians, and which would therefore amount to an attack by those NATO countries involved in it on Russia, amounting to an act of war. And of course, as we know, that was done. We know from an article in the New York Times that the agreement to do it was made in April 2024. And after a story about North Korean troops in Kursk region was, well, spread, even though those North Korean troops never, well, proof of their existence never appeared. Well, the missile strikes duly came in November. It was originally said that they would be targeted at the North Koreans in Kursk region, except many of the attacks took place outside Kursk region. So we were seeing throughout 2024, even as Ukraine's army buckled and retreated on the battlefield, an incredibly dangerous process of escalation. Steps taken by the Western powers, by the Biden administration, which the Russians said amounted to acts of war, about which, by the way, they are completely correct. And Donald Trump came in, and he clearly wants to bring that all to an end. We've had no more missile strikes on the Russians, incidentally, since he was inaugurated president. We've had a dialogue re-established with the Russians. The American and Russian leaders have spoken with each other over the telephone. There has been a meeting in Riyadh where the American and Russian foreign ministers have met and have had a friendly meeting, and which has led to discussions about lifting sanctions and re-establishing embassies and getting the embassies working again, and basically re-establishing the historic and absolutely necessary contact between the superpowers, the American and Russian superpowers, which are necessary to preserve peace. So those are two objectives that Donald Trump has. One, to end the war. Second, to stabilize the international situation by resuming contacts with the Russians. It is not difficult to see this. He's talked about it and he's taken steps to bring it about. But his third objective is to end this drain of American resources, which is what the conflict in Ukraine has become. The handing over of hundreds of billions of dollars, the systematic depletion of American inventories, 500 ATACMS missiles supplied to Ukraine. Again, we got that, I think it was from the New York Times. But anyway, the American media has written about it. Hundreds of Bradley infantry fighting vehicles sent to Ukraine. Stockpiles of Patriot air defense missiles massively depleted because more and more of them have been sent to Ukraine. Donald Trump says this has got to stop. It's gone too far. The time has come to bring the gravy train to an end. So he's trying to do this. He's trying to do these three things: to end the war, to stabilize the situation with the Russians, and to end what he calls the gravy train by moving, by trying to get some kind of dialogue towards peace started. Now, contrary to all kinds of scaremongering claims that I've been seeing all over the place, there was no negotiation between the Russians and the Americans in Riyadh about plans to end the war in Ukraine. There was no discussion about that at all. The Americans and the Russians have both said that the negotiation, when it takes place, must take place between Russia and Ukraine. Those are the two parties that are fighting each other. They must negotiate an outcome to the war. The Americans will appoint a high representative to deal with the Russians on that question. The Russians will do the same. But the idea is to try to get some kind of negotiation process between the Russians and the Americans underway in order finally to bring the war to an end. And it has become quite clear that there is no American plan that claims that there was a plan, the Strana plan. Lavrov asked Rubio and Waltz in Riyadh, is this indeed your plan? And they came back and said, no, it is not. So we should accept that again. After all, we have this from the Russians. The Russians got it from the Americans, and there is no reason to suppose that this is not the case. So this is what Trump and his people are trying to do. They're not trying to come to an agreement over the heads of the Ukrainians. They're trying to get the Russians and the Ukrainians to sit down and to negotiate with each other and to agree a peace so that Trump can achieve his three objectives: to end the war, about which he says he cares. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe it's just, as I said, show. But anyway, that's what he says. To stabilize the international situation, ultimately, so that the United States can pull its forces out of Europe and redeploy them to the Far East and perhaps take on the Chinese there. I mean, no doubt there is a strong element of that. And thirdly, to get the Ukrainians and the Russians talking to each other so that the gravy train can end, a peace can be achieved, and the United States can extricate itself from the war in Ukraine. Now, if the Ukrainians refuse to speak to the Russians, if they won't sit down and negotiate, and coming back to Zelensky's press conference, he gave no real indication that that is what he is prepared or interested in doing. He's not rescinding his decree. He's been invited by the Russians, as I discussed yesterday, Peskov talked about it, to appoint his own high representative to sit down and to negotiate with the Russians, but he's not doing that. There's no word that he's interested in doing that. If the Ukrainians will not negotiate, if they won't sit down with the Russians, then at some point, the logic of Trump's words, what he set out on Truth Social, means that the Americans will walk away. If they cannot end the war, because the Ukrainians won't end it, if the Ukrainians continue to get help from the Europeans to continue the war, if what Donald Trump, correctly by the way, calls the tragedy of the war continues, well, Trump has set it out. It's not a core interest of the United States. It might be a major matter for Europe, but as he says, we have a big, beautiful ocean as separation. But we can walk away. We have no reason to go on with this gravy train, as he puts it. We can just walk away. And the Ukrainians and the Europeans can be left to sort it out by themselves. Now, Zelensky's press conference, his absolutely disastrous, catastrophic press conference, has brought that point much closer. Now, this is something which I'm not sure whether Zelensky himself understands. I'm not sure that it is something that the Europeans fully understand. But this is the logic of what Trump is saying. Now, Trump, as I said, was furious, and he expressed himself in very, very strong terms. But in the hours that followed, his administration closed ranks around him. Vice President Vance said that it was absolutely wrong for Zelensky to speak about Donald Trump in that way. It is absolutely not going to change Donald Trump's mind. Mike Waltz also weighed in and said that Zelensky was basically out of order in talking in that kind of fashion. Elon Musk and others in the MAGA movement have been busy tweeting all kinds of information about Zelensky himself, some of it very salacious, and I'm not going to repeat it. But anyway, it was all pouring out. In fact, it's not just me, Elon Musk and David Sachs and people like that, but it's all over the MAGA side of the internet, all kinds of extraordinary revelations about Zelensky, or at least claimed revelations about Zelensky, which are now being presented to the American people as they have never been presented before. But one way or the other, we are now decisively closer to the point where the Americans will say, we've done what we can, we've tried to get the Russians and the Ukrainians to talk. We've had a very, very good and productive meeting with the Russians. Trump has just said this again. Very good, productive meeting. We found that the Russians were reasonable people. We could talk about all kinds of things with them, not just Ukraine. We have lots of interesting things to say. The Russians have told us about how interested they are in economic cooperation with ourselves. And if Zelensky is not willing to go, if he's not prepared to hold elections, if he's not prepared to rescind his decree, if he's not prepared to sit down with the Russians and acknowledge the need to make concessions, well, we have had enough. It is up to Zelensky. Zelensky better move fast, or he is not going to have a country left. The responsibility, those are Trump's words, the responsibility ultimately is up to Zelensky and no one else. Well, there it is. That, in my opinion, is what happened yesterday. As I said, someone, probably in Kiev, but perhaps after discussions with some of the European capitals, London, Paris, Berlin, Brussels, miscalculated horribly. They thought they could embarrass and perhaps to some extent even bully Trump into statements of support for Zelensky or backing off on Zelensky in some kind of way and Ukraine in some kind of way. Maybe they were hoping for statements from the Americans that the Ukrainians would in fact be involved in future negotiations between the Americans and the Russians. I'll come to that shortly. But instead, what they have got is a statement from the President of the United States, backed by his administration and by his electoral constituency, which points in a few weeks or months, if the Europeans and the Ukrainians maintain their present stance, when the United States finally switches off completely the tap of support which has been provided to Ukraine, when the gravy train, as Trump put it, finally ends. Well, there we are. This was, as I said, a catastrophically misjudged series of moves by Zelensky and his media handlers. Trump, as I said, is clearly angry, but in this Truth Social post, he has also given us an insight into where he and ultimately the United States appears to be heading. And it's one that neither Zelensky nor the Europeans appear to have expected, and even now they're not taking full heed of. Anyway, let's move on and discuss some further points that need to be made. Firstly, a G7 statement was apparently being negotiated by the Americans and the Europeans on the occasion of the 4th anniversary of the start of the special military operation. And it looks as if that statement is not going to appear because the Trump administration apparently refuses to include the word aggression in the statement. And we have this from the Financial Times. US objects to calling out Russian aggression in G7 statement on Ukraine. The United States is opposing calling Russia the aggressor in a G7 statement on the third, I think it is the third actually, anniversary of Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, threatening to derail the traditional show of unity, according to 5 Western officials familiar with the matter. And there we are. So I'd noticed for some time, I mentioned this previously, that State Department readouts of conversations between the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio and European counterparts, whenever the topic of Ukraine was mentioned, never referred to Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. The Americans have for some time stopped using that language, and apparently the Europeans again didn't read the readouts carefully enough, because when they came and tried to draft a G7 statement, they found that the Americans were pushing back. Well, I suspect there's going to be a lot of agonizing and discussion about this. We will see whether a G7 statement appears. It could be that the Americans will give some ground. We shall see. But for the moment, we have further evidence of a widening rift between the Americans and the Russians on this question. And in the meantime, Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron are apparently coming to Washington with their plan for peacekeepers in Ukraine. The British are now saying that they will commit 5,000, that there will be a peacekeeping force of 30,000 altogether. One wonders where the other troops are going to come from. And also that there will be air cover provided by the Royal Air Force operating from bases in Poland. My guess is that the Americans will listen to all of this and they'll shrug their shoulders and say, well, if that's your plan, good luck. Because the Russians have again made it crystal clear that they are not going to agree to this, and that without the Russians, this simply cannot happen. Even the Starmer administration appears to accept that this plan can only work with Russian consent. Anyway, Peskov has spoken about this. He's spoken today. He said the deployment of NATO countries' troops to Ukraine cannot be acceptable for Russia. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov had said this before. Indeed, he said this yesterday when he was commenting upon the discussions he'd had with Marco Rubio and the Americans in Riyadh. And the article says that the Daily Telegraph is absolutely correct, citing Western officials, said that Kiev's European allies intended to suggest to Washington deployment of at least 30,000 peacekeepers, troops from members from various European countries to Ukraine, and that Western troops are supposed to be deployed to Ukraine's largest cities, including Poltava, Dnipropetrovsk and Kryvyi Rog, as well as key ports and vital infrastructure and facilities, namely nuclear power plants, with the goal being to reduce the risk of a direct confrontation between NATO forces and the Russian army. Well, as I said, the Russians have said that they won't accept this. So there is no conceivable way that this can be agreed in any negotiation involving the Russians. The Russians are bound to say no. Now, I suspect that at some point, Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, when it becomes increasingly obvious that the Russians are going to say no, are going to come along and get Zelensky's agreement to this disastrous idea. and are then going to agitate in Washington for this terrible plan to go ahead. I would not be surprised myself if at some point over the next few weeks or months, Zelensky announces a unilateral ceasefire. He's resisted that in the past, but as we shall see, his army is losing territory all the time. And announcing the ceasefire, he also announces that he's come to this agreement also unilaterally with the British and the French and the other Europeans to deploy these troops to Ukraine. And he might also conceivably say that this agreement could involve air patrols by Typhoon fighter jets from Poland and all of those things. Now, that, of course, not only would be unacceptable to the Russians, it would almost certainly mean the immediate collapse of the ceasefire, because the Russians have already made clear, Lavrov said it yesterday, that as far as they are concerned, the presence of European forces in Ukraine in this kind of way is as bad as Ukraine's outright admission into NATO. And of course, Starmer is continuing to say that Ukraine is on an irreversible course towards NATO. So the ceasefire, this unilateral ceasefire that Zelensky would then announce, would be declared by the Russians unacceptable. They wouldn't acknowledge it, and the fighting would simply continue. And then, of course, what would happen is that the British and the French would again come scuttling back to the Americans. They would say, look, the Russians are breaching the ceasefire. You can't allow our troops to be attacked in this fashion. You must come to our rescue. And if, of course, British fighter jets in Poland start getting shot down, and if the Russians start launching Oreshnik strikes on Polish bases, then again, the Europeans will ask the Americans to become involved. This is a disastrous plan. As I said, the Russians will reject it. The Americans will undoubtedly refuse to become involved. Pressing on with these terrible ideas simply ignores what the Americans and not just Trump, but Hegseth and others are saying. And it is setting up the British Army for complete disaster. There's even been an article today in the Daily Telegraph by none other than Con Coughlin, a British journalist who, to put it mildly, always and invariably takes the hardest line on geopolitical issues. He is a dyed-in-the-wool neocon. Anyway, he says this. He says that Starmer's peacekeeping plan is doomed to fail. All that it will do will put a profoundly inadequate British army in harm's way. In fact, it will present it to the Russians on a plate, and the Russians will just gobble it up. It would be a military and geopolitical disaster, and one which could, by the way, end NATO, something which at times I get the sense that Donald Trump himself would not be too sorry to see happen. And, well, I think that it would be helpful if the Americans explained all of this to Macron and Starmer when they arrived in Washington. If the Americans said clearly that if you want to go ahead with this plan, you must understand that not only must the Russians agree, but you would be doing this completely without the United States. There will be no backstop. There will be no guarantees. This plan will not be backstopped by the United States. If you get into trouble, you are on your own. Anyway, there is a very interesting article in the Daily Telegraph by the journalist Sam Ashworth-Hayes, one which, a journalist, by the way, whom I briefly met recently in Hungary, and where I was very favourably impressed by him. But Sam Ashworth-Hayes makes a point which I have never seen made in the media before. He actually looks at the economic cost of the war for Britain. And he says it's time to face facts. Britain can't afford to support Ukraine. The cost of containing Russia for 2 years has already taken a big bite out of the UK's budget. And he says that this figure of £12 billion, which is the amount of money that Britain has already officially spent on the war, giving Ukraine arms, giving Ukraine financial support, is simply one part of the total cost. In fact, the true cost of the war for Ukraine, for Britain, of supporting Ukraine in the war, has been much greater. And he says this: the general analysis is that in exchange for £12.8 billion in aid and equipment, about a third of a year's defence spending, Britain was able to give Putin a bloody nose and stabilise Ukraine's forces until US aid arrived. That is what people are saying, and by the way, already it isn't true. The problem with this analysis is that it massively understates the costs involved. Perhaps the most important economic consequence of the war in Ukraine was the decision to cut supplies of Russian gas to Europe, taken in part by Vladimir Putin attempting to put pressure on his neighbours. Well, I'm not going to go into all of that. And in part by those countries moving to switch away from reliance on Moscow and the cascading effects through energy markets. The direct costs to the government of this cut can be easily summed up. Between the various schemes targeted at relieving the pressure of energy bills on households and businesses, the Treasury paid out £44 billion between 2022 and 2024. Remember that, and then he talks about the fact that there is a £44 billion gap in British defence spending in order to bring the British Army back to the kind of level it had in 2010. And then he goes on to say, rather than spending on armaments, Britain spent on maintaining domestic support, while some of the £44 billion was offset by taxes on energy producers. It is not a negligible sum, particularly when put next to the economic consequences of higher energy prices. We can try to work out some of those consequences by going through the data. Prior to the pandemic, Britain burnt roughly 10 to 16 billion pounds worth of natural gas, the equivalent of somewhere between 73 million and 75 million tonnes of oil. In 2022, it spent around 47 billion pounds for 67 million tonnes equivalent in oil, and in 2023, 46 billion pounds for 60 million tonnes equivalent of oil. Some of this spend accrued to domestic producers and exporters, but around £44 billion appears to have ended up in net imports. Had prices stayed where they were in the 3 years before the pandemic, we would have spent £36 billion less in 2022 and saved around the same in 2023. Recall, this is a drop in the quantity of gas burnt, likely a reduction in cost around £22 billion. And then he goes on to say that there's been a significant effect on GDP growth. The Office for Budget Responsibility suggests that the elasticity of UK output with respect to fossil fuel prices is around minus 0.013. In English, this means that prices rise, that if prices rise 10%, GDP will likely fall 0.13%. If they rise 100%, GDP drops 1.3%. Gas prices over the last few years have generally been multiples of their previous levels, with a roughly 360% premium in 2022 and a 100% premium in 2023. Gas is not the only fossil fuel input into the UK economy. Brent crude rose less sharply, and there were other reasons for prices to rise as the economy reopened after the pandemic. But putting it all together, he comes to the overall view that the overall cost in 2022 and 2023 to Britain of support for Ukraine comes to somewhere around £79 billion. Bear in mind that Britain is currently in a budgetary crisis. And then he goes on to say it's likely that the burst of inflation the war has fueled cost the Conservative Party whatever slim chance they had of retaining office last year. Sir Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have made themselves unpopular enough already. Are they really going to push through further tax rises for a mass permanent deployment to Eastern Europe? It's a very good question. Anyway, there we go. That's of the first article I have seen in Britain which tries to ask the question of what the real economic cost for Britain of support for Zelensky has been. Others can no doubt come up with different figures. It's up to them. I suspect some people will come up with higher figures. These questions about the cost of the war have not been asked previously. We can see them play out every day in Britain. Notice that this article only covers the cost for 2022, 2023. Presumably there are no analogous figures for 2024. Britain cannot afford economically the indefinite cost of this particular war. Anyway, there we are. Now, it's important to stress that what continues to drive the situation is the war itself. And here we have had a very extraordinary, very interesting press conference given by no less a person than President Putin. He too was asked questions yesterday. It's all been overlooked in the storm and theatre of the Trump-Zelensky exchanges. But over the course of it, Putin made some very, very interesting points. He said that the Ukrainians are so angry about not participating in the meetings between the Americans and the Russians. The Europeans are angry because they did not participate in this meeting in Riyadh between the Americans and the Russians. But why should they even be at this meeting? This was a meeting between Russia and the United States, in which these two countries, both global superpowers, had many things to talk about with each other. I believe we have made the first step to resuming work across a variety of areas of mutual interest, including the Middle East, in the broad sense of the word. I mean our presence in Syria, the Palestinian-Israeli settlement, and so on. There are many issues that involve both the United States and Russia, even though, of course, the situation in Ukraine is our priority. We have other matters to consider, such as the economy, our joint activities on global energy markets, space, and many, many other things. And he said, why should we not meet and talk about these things with each other? And then he was asked the question. The Europeans are rather agitated, almost in panic, that they are not participating in the negotiations in any way. And similar sentiments prevail among Ukrainian officials. Everyone wants a voice. What should be done with all of them? And then Putin responded, a voice in what? I have just stated that the purpose and subject of our negotiations was the restoration of Russian-American relations. Does someone wish to act as a mediator between Russia and the United States? These are excessive demands. The crux of resolving all highly acute issues, including the Ukrainian settlement, lies in the fact that without enhancing the level of trust between Russia and the United States, it is impossible to resolve many problems, including the Ukrainian crisis. And then he comes to the absolute rub. As for other participants, Russia has never refused contacts with European counterparts. Russia has never turned its back on negotiations with Ukraine. Never. It is our counterparts in these discussions who have chosen to withdraw. The Europeans terminated contacts with Russia, and the Ukrainian side has self-imposed a ban on negotiations, withdrawing from the Istanbul process and publicly announcing that. Well, we are not imposing anything on anyone. We are prepared. I have already stated this 100 times. If they so desire, let them conduct these negotiations, and we will be ready to return to the negotiating table. And regarding Euro-Atlantic relations, we do not interfere. We do not engage in conjecture about various issues that emerge between the United States and its allies, and it's up to them. And we can talk to the Americans, that's basically what he's saying. And if the Europeans want to talk to us, and if the Ukrainians want to talk with us, that's fine. So how are they being excluded? He is absolutely right, by the way. It is the Ukrainians and the Europeans who continue to exclude themselves. And Zelensky's press conference suggested that this has not changed in any way. The same applies to the Europeans also. As Peskov said yesterday, if the Ukrainians want to appoint a representative to negotiate with Moscow, why don't they do so? Why don't they rescind Zelensky's 2nd October 2022 decree prohibiting themselves from doing that and appoint a representative? Why don't the Europeans, all of the European countries, send representatives to Moscow? Why don't they pick up the phone? If they want to do that, then negotiations can take place. Now, here I want to mention something that has been brought up by various people in threads to my videos, to live streams that I've done and we've done on the Duran, to videos that we have done on the Duran as well, which is that the Europeans and the Ukrainians are now furious that the Americans and the Russians are excluding them from the talks, even though, as Putin said, they're not actually being excluded from the talks, not about Ukraine. The Americans and the Russians can talk to each other. They can talk to each other about Ukraine, and that is their right. They are two superpowers. They have a right to do that. The United States has been supplying weapons and material to Ukraine. It has an absolute right, if it chooses, to talk to the Russians about it. And it has a right, absolute right, if it chooses, to stop supporting Ukraine in the way it has been doing. That is an American prerogative, and no one should deny it. But when it came to excluding or trying to exclude a party from negotiations about ending the war, it was the Americans, the Biden administration, the Europeans, and the Ukrainians who actually tried to do that to the Russians. During 2023, in August 2023, the first of a succession of so-called peace summits was arranged by the Ukrainians, the Americans, and the Europeans. The first one, as I remember, was in Copenhagen. The last one happened last year, in the summer of last year, in Switzerland. And the thing about all of those so-called peace summits is that the Russians were excluded from every one. The Russians were told, as I remember, roughly at this time last year, by the Swiss, that they would be able to attend the one in Switzerland. And then they discovered that what would happen if they attended the one in Switzerland is that there would be all the discussions in one room, and the Russians would be left by themselves in another room, and when the consensus was reached, the Russians would be presented with it. And of course the Russians said, we're not going to go through with that kind of farce. So the only people who have seriously tried to exclude anybody from serious negotiations or discussions about the war are the Europeans, the Biden administration, and of course the Ukrainians, the people who are refusing to engage in negotiations. We saw that again, to repeat once more, with Zelensky's press conference, are the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians say from time to time that they are prepared to sit down and have negotiations with the Russians. But when you examine their positions carefully, it's clear that they are not. They still want to keep American support and European support. They play with words. They do this all the time. They take a massively manipulative support approach. But when it comes to the serious question of negotiations, to rescinding their decree, appointing a negotiating team, agreeing a place where they and the Russians can meet, well, that simply never happens. Well, there we are. That was the substance of what Putin said. He also touched on the military situation. And he said that the most important news that he'd heard was that the Russian troops, after the capture of Sverdlikovo in Kursk region, have now entered Sumy region in Ukraine, that they've crossed the border and that there is fighting going on in Sumy region. Now, he didn't provide any details, and we haven't actually had many details, but Putin spoke about it as if it was important. And, well, a reasonable guess is that following the capture of Sverdlikovo, and with group of forces north saying that the Russians have now reached the outskirts of the next village they need to capture before they reach the Sumy Suja road, the key supply road the Ukrainians use. This is the village of Lebedeva. The Russians are also advancing into Sumy region, also with the objective of cutting this road. This threatens the potential creation of a major cauldron trapping Ukrainian troops in Kursk region. And of course, that has been partly enabled because of Zelensky's obsessive insistence that those Ukrainian troops must remain there, even despite the fact that the entire Kursk operation has long since lost any possible military significance or strategic meaning. Anyway, Putin also said that the Russians are continuing their advance all across the contact line. And by the way, they are. As I said in my program yesterday, the Russian advance, which slowed during a period of difficult weather in midwinter, is now accelerating again. The Russians are advancing rapidly west of Velikaya Novosilka, which they captured about 2 weeks ago. General Teplinsky's group of forces, Dnieper, Russians in Kherson and Zaporozhye region, have apparently recaptured the village of Pyatikhatki, thus, by the way, erasing the last remaining village, the last remaining gain that the Ukrainians achieved during their famous summer 2023 offensive. The recapture of Pyatikhatki and this advance from Velikaya Novosilka clearly points to a pending Russian operation towards Zaporozhye, the great industrial city on the Dnieper, the loss of which would be a disaster for Ukraine. And the Russians continue to advance everywhere else. The Ukrainian counterattacks southwest of Pakrovsk, the attempted recapture of Pishanye, the attempted recapture of Kotlino, they've all completely failed. The Russians are advancing there as well. The reports speak of the Russians having completed not just the capture of Andreevka. I believe they captured Andreevka fully some days ago. Never mind. But that they have also either captured or mostly captured the village of Urakli that lies south of Andreevka in the Kurakhovo pocket. Apparently there's hundreds of Ukrainian troops basically surrounded in this area, and the Russians have recently been releasing film of large numbers of Ukrainian prisoners that they say they have captured in this area. The Russians are now pushing north from Toretsk. They're showing more evidence of the continued capture of Chasiv Yar. It's likely that Chasiv Yar will be fully under Russian control sometime in early March, just saying. The Russians, as I said, in many places, have crossed both the Oskol and Zherebets rivers. They've established significant bridgeheads there. And apparently they've also crossed the border, the Russian-Ukrainian border, at the very north, upstream on the Oskol River. And they've captured another village, this is Toplino, I believe, close to the border, creating a potential crisis for the Ukrainians in Kharkiv region, with the Russians perhaps aiming to link up their forces in Volchansk, which is now mostly captured, with their forces west of the Oskol River and located north of Kupiansk. It's a disastrous picture. And I should say that the American analyst, military geostrategic analyst, Gordon Hahn, on his actually exceptional blog, has been discussing the disastrous state of the Ukrainian army and the way in which it is gradually eroding away. And these processes seem to be accelerating, and there doesn't seem to be anything that can be done to reverse them. Gordon Hunt clearly doesn't believe that there is any prospect, for example, of the Ukrainians carrying out another successful mobilization at any point in the future. So to repeat again, we've had an astonishing 24 hours. The Ukrainians and their media handlers in Europe, Zelensky himself, have not only personally insulted and antagonized Donald Trump, but they brought significantly closer the day when the Americans will completely cut off all remaining military aid. In fact, even as I've been making this program, I've seen a report that the Americans are now ceasing all further supplies of intelligence to the Ukrainians, enabling the Ukrainians to make missile and rocket attacks anywhere along the contact line, or perhaps drone attacks deep inside Russia. The event that might have provoked that, by the way, was an attack on a pumping station on Russian territory, which pumped oil from Kazakhstan along various pipelines. So this is, we're talking about Kazakh oil which is not covered by Western sanctions. And it seems that this pumping station was owned by an international consortium, of which the major shareholder was the American oil company Chevron. Just saying. If that was the case, then, as I said, the Ukrainians appear to have done an incredibly foolish thing. But one way or the other, it looks as if the Americans are no longer going to be providing that kind of data anymore. So, a massively consequential day. The Europeans still living out their fantasies. Starmer and Macron coming up with crazy plans. But we are now definitely in the end game, and Zelensky has brought it closer. Well, this is where I finish today's program. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by visiting our shop, links under this video. Don't forget to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel if you've liked this video. There'll be more from me soon. Have a very good day.